And you're live in the CNN newsroom. I'm Pamela Brown in Washington on this Saturday. And this just into CNN. We are hearing now finally some details from the Trump White House after an entire day of silence. Details that might shed some light on a bizarre set of statements from the president that are making even the most seasoned political operatives scratch their heads. Outright accusations, not hints or innuendo, but pointed charges from the president that his predecessor, Barack Obama, ordered the telephones at Trump Tower tapped in the weeks leading up to Election Day. It's a shocking and very serious charge that the president failed to support with any sourcing, any evidence, or anything to back up those claims. On the phone with me now, our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. So, Jim, what can you tell me?
Yes, Pamela, that's right. We can tell you that President Trump was very frustrated with his senior staff and communications team on Friday morning, just before he departed for Mar-a-Lago. According to one source that I spoke to, quote, nobody has seen him that upset, end quote. The feeling being inside the Oval Office, and we had a camera there that was rolling where you could see officials having a heated conversation with one another. The feeling inside the Oval Office, according to sources we're talking to, is that the communications team, the press team of the White House had allowed the news of Jeff Sessions recusing himself from the Trump campaign Russia investigation had sort of overtaken the narrative of the week. They were feeling very enthusiastic after the president's performance at that speech to a joint session of Congress on Tuesday. And from what we're hearing from sources, the president was very upset that Sessions had even recused himself from the case. That was something, according to one source, that the president thought was hasty and overkill. He was hot. He was exasperated over this because he felt that basically they were just giving their adversaries up on Capitol Hill more ammunition by having Jeff Sessions recuse himself. The other thing that we're hearing from sources close to all of this is that Ryan Priebus, the White House chief of staff, and Stephen Bannon, the chief strategist for the president, were both scheduled to go down with the president yesterday, but those plans, those travel plans, abruptly changed. Now, we should point out, while Priebus did not make the trip, Steve Bannon did go down today, and he's having dinner right now along with other top officials with the president there at Mar-a-Lago. Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, Homeland Security Secretary Kelly, and so on. But Pamela, no question about it, this breaking news that we saw late in the week where Jeff Sessions recused himself because he did not accurately talk about his having met with the Russian ambassador to the U.S., and that entire story just infuriated the president. And in the words of one source that I talked to, the president basically told his team that the staff fumbled on all of this, Pamela.
Great reporting there, Jim Acosta. So I'm curious, you said that he wasn't happy about the fact that the Attorney General recused himself, that he said it was hastily done. Was he frustrated at all that the Attorney General hadn't disclosed his meetings with Russia's ambassador to the U.S.? I mean, that is really what prompted the Washington Post to report that these meetings and the fact that he didn't disclose them, and then that's, then the next day he recused himself. Did he talk about that at all and that frustration surrounding that?
Well, I think to some extent from what we're hearing from talking to sources is that the president does feel a bit blindsided by all of this. I was with the president on Air Force One, traveled with him on Thursday when he went down to that aircraft carrier in Newport News, and I even asked him at the time, do you think that the Attorney General should have been more forthcoming about his contacts with the Russian ambassador? And at that time, the president said to me, I think he probably was. Well, it turns out later on that night, the White House puts out a statement from the president himself on all of this. And in that statement, the president says, well, I think that Attorney General Sessions could have used a better language, more clear language in talking about all of this. Now, I have talked to a source very close to the West Wing who said earlier today that much of the president's frustration lies with what he believes to be a sort of a botched process inside his White House press and communications team that essentially allowed this Sessions Russian ambassador story to sort of mushroom over the last 48 to 72 hours to the point where the Attorney General himself had to recuse himself from that case. That is essentially where the president is very, very frustrated and disappointed, because he feels like on that Tuesday night to a joint session of Congress, and you talk to a lot of officials around the White House, they really felt like he hit a home run, And then once again, by the end of the week, these Russia questions return to the scene, return to dominate the discussion. And so the president is just extremely frustrated by all of this. As I said, in the words of one source close to this West Wing that I talked to earlier today, familiar with these discussions that went on in the Oval Office that got very heated Friday morning, quote, nobody has seen him that upset. That is how deeply frustrated and disappointed the president was about all of this, Pamela.
Let me just ask you this, Jim, before I let you go. I mean, it's clear from your reporting the president was very unhappy with the headlines involving Jeff Sessions and his meeting with Russia and how that overshadowed his State of the Union address. Is there any indication from the sources you've been speaking with that his tweets this morning with these unsubstantiated allegations that President Obama wiretapped his phone, is there any indication that was an attempt by President Trump to change the dialogue and to sort of create a distraction from those headlines he didn't like?
No, not at this point. We do know that the staff folks that we've been talking to in the White House, they were a bit caught off guard by the president's tweets this morning when he was accusing the former President Barack Obama of having orchestrated some sort of wiretapping scheme to do surveillance on the then candidate Trump or then President-elect Trump over at Trump Tower in New York City. According to sources we talked to inside the White House, top staff people were just not aware that the president was going to tweet this. And so I think that gives you some indication, Pamela, that this is a president who has gone and gotten more and more frustrated, increasingly frustrated as the days went on at the end of this week because of this Russia issue, which has dogged the president for so many weeks and months now, has flared up once again.
All right, Jim Acosta, thank you so much for your reporting there. Do appreciate it. And I want to bring in CNN senior political analyst David Gergen, joins me live. So, David, you have served as a White House advisor to Presidents Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. What is your reaction to this latest news from Jim Acosta?
Well, Jim's reporting, as always, is excellent. I must tell you that the fact that the president was so frustrated because the Sessions story distracted from his speech and the power of his speech makes it all the more puzzling, mystifying why he would then go on this tweet rant today, which has only amplified the coverage and the questions about the Russian story, about what was going on in Trump Tower. He's created a whole new set of problems for himself. So at the end of the week, the speech seemed long ago, and we're into new territory with new controversies. So I find it just totally mystifying how the two things are connected. I thought you asked Jim Acosta exactly the right question. Well, if he was so frustrated, why did he do this? And I do think maybe he thinks it's a distraction, but the fact is that this charge against President Obama that he wiretapped Donald Trump's phones is a smear. And either Mr. Trump, President Trump, should come forward with proof, or he owes an apology to President Obama and, frankly, to the country. You can't smear a former president in this way and not expect to have a lot of blowback. Where the hell's the proof? What are you talking about? Now, Pamela, it is possible, and a couple of the Obama aides have been putting this word out, John Favreau among them. It is possible that the FBI, on its own, back in the fall, went to a court, one of these so-called FISA courts, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, empowers a court to give the government authority to go wiretap somebody's phone. But if the FISA court did that, they very likely didn't go against President Trump. They very likely went against someone else like Paul Manafort, who might be around the Trump Tower or someone like that. We don't know enough, but there is zero evidence that President Obama wiretapped Donald Trump's phone.
Right. I mean, there are checks and balances in place to prohibit a president from ordering someone's phone to be wiretapped. The FBI independently would go to a judge and would have to show probable cause in order to get that warrant approved by the judge. Let me just ask you this, because he tweets about President Obama ordering this wiretap on his phone, and then shortly after he tweets about Celebrity Apprentice and saying that Arnold Schwarzenegger was fired and so forth. In that context, do you think the president understood the enormity of the allegations he was making against the former president?
That's a very good question, Pamela. I have to believe he may not have fully appreciated at 6:30 in the morning just how much of an explosion he was going to cause by making those allegations. But I would point out in the very speech that the White House has been trumpeting, I think that speech was very successful as a political argument. It was very, very successful. But it was in that same speech only a few days ago that he said the time for trivial arguments is over. And yet now we're back into him calling names and talking about the Celebrity Apprentice. Hey, you got to have it one way or the other. You can't keep having it both ways.
So obviously you have been in many White Houses with different presidents. How unusual is it for a president to get really angry like this at his staff for letting a news story overshadow something that they feel like shouldn't be overshadowed? I mean, how common is this, just for context?
It is quite common for presidents to be angry. The best presidents get over it pretty quickly. I've seen presidents who will erupt like Mount Vesuvius, and it goes on for a while. Bill Clinton had a temper, for example, but he got it over. He got it over very quickly, and they don't carry around these grudges, these resentments, except for Richard Nixon. He bore resentments for a long time, had an enemies list, and all the rest. But I also think, I must tell you, Pamela, it seems to me the anger here is misdirected at his communications staff. The anger really ought to be with what happened with Jeff Sessions. What about his legal team? Why weren't they talking to the White House legal team? How did they get to be caught so flat-footed on this question of the testimony? And then the communications team at the White House did not decide, I can guarantee you this, that Jeff Sessions would recuse himself. That would be a decision Jeff Sessions would work out with the chief of staff at the White House and the general counsel at the White House, not with the communications staff. So, I think he's firing at the wrong targets. He's been firing at Obama. He's been firing at his own staff. Maybe he ought to back up and think for a moment. Maybe some of it's coming from him.
Well, that's why I was asking Jim, because it struck me that he was so upset with his staff letting this story sort of overshadow his speech, and he was upset that Jeff Sessions recused himself right after the story broke. Right. But it seemed like he wasn't as angry about what Jeff Sessions did that led to this, which was not disclose during the confirmation hearing that he had met with Russians, and not only that, but didn't disclose it in the weeks after until it was released in the press.
Right. It's once again, the enemy press has once again forced the White House to make an acknowledgement or say something that they didn't apparently plan to want to say. But that's not a fault of his communications team. He's got some internal issues. I understand why he's frustrated. I think he put a lot of himself, a lot of his time and effort into that speech this week, and it was a successful speech. So to have it all change on him so quickly must be frustrating. I'm sympathetic with presidents who go through that. Having said that, there are lessons there about maybe you ought to reorganize your White House staff in a way that it can handle issues like this, and with more internal communication, more checking with him. Obviously Sessions must have recused himself without the president's knowledge that he was going to do that. That surprised me in and of itself.
Yeah, I'm just curious, given all of your experience, I mean, we're a little over a month into his administration. Sure. What do you think some of the tough lessons he's learning right now are, beyond what you just stated?
Well, I think one of the tough lessons he's learning, Pamela, when he was very successful at his business, but he was running a private company. And what that meant was he did not have a board that he reported to, and he did not have shareholders that, in effect, he reported to. And I think he's finding that the freewheeling style that he could use in a private business is very different from governing a hugely complex institution with lots of constitutional checks and balances, as well as traditional normative cultural checks and balances. And it's hard. It's hard work. It's hard to govern. You've got to be well organized. You cannot wing it. You've got to have a great team around you. You've got to have people with experience around you. And you've got to listen and be deliberative. He took time out to prepare well for that speech. That same kind of preparation that went into that went into the Gorsuch nomination process, which also paid off very well, has got to go into every day of governing in order to be successful.
All right, David Gergen, thank you as always for your
analysis.
Okay. We appreciate it. And still to come right here in the CNN newsroom on this Saturday, more on President Trump making explosive allegations against his predecessor, accusing former President Obama of wiretapping Trump Tower and even suggesting he could be mentally ill. That's coming up right after this break.